My dad counted the cash in my wallet at the Christmas dinner table in front of every relative we had and announced that I had nothing to show for myself. What he didn't know was that a notification had appeared on my phone that very morning, one that would completely change the way he saw me. The truth was folded inside a Christmas card, and when he finally opened it, 3 years of assumptions came crashing down. Before I get into everything that happened, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My name is Rue. I'm 27 years old and live in a town in central Ohio. I've always been the quiet one in the family. Not shy exactly, just someone who prefers doing the work instead of talking about it. My father, Dale, spent most of his life working at the same manufacturing plant. He believed success was simple. You got a stable job, collected a steady paycheck, and stayed there for years. Anything outside that formula looked risky to him. My mother, June, was different. She was kind and supportive, but she hated conflict. Whenever tension started building, she would rush to smooth things over before anyone got upset. 3 years before that Christmas dinner, I made a decision that changed my life. I quit my data entry job at an insurance company and started an online business selling handmade linen products. I worked from a spare bedroom using a second-hand sewing machine. There was no team, no investors, and no guarantee it would succeed. Just me, long hours, and a belief that I could build something of my own. When I told my family, my father laughed. He wasn't yelling or trying to be cruel. It was almost worse because he sounded genuinely convinced the idea was ridiculous. He repeated the phrase, selling napkins on the internet, like it was a punchline. My uncle chuckled along with him while everyone else avoided looking at me. I remember forcing a smile that night. I helped clear the table, thanked my mother for dinner, and drove home pretending it didn't bother me. But it did. Every laugh and dismissive comment stayed with me long after the holiday ended. Instead of arguing, I made a choice. I would stop trying to convince people. I would let the results speak when the time was right. After that Christmas, life became a cycle of work, patience, and keeping my head down. I didn't spend time defending my decision anymore. Nobody seemed interested in hearing about the long hours, the mistakes, or the small wins. So I focused on building my business one order at a time. The first year was harder than I had expected. By December, I had made just over $6,000. It wasn't enough to impress anyone, but it was enough to prove that strangers were willing to pay for something I had created. I tracked every expense in a spiral notebook. If I bought thread, fabric, shipping supplies, or even a cup of coffee during a workday, it went into that notebook. Money stayed tight. Most evenings I ate simple meals because they were cheap and easy. When my old laptop started struggling to handle product photos, I sold it and used the money toward a better camera. Good pictures meant more sales, and more sales meant another chance to keep going. I never called my father to update him on any of it. When Christmas arrived again, the family gathered around the same table. While helping in the kitchen, my cousin Lena quietly told me that Dad had been referring to my business as the napkin thing all year. I wasn't surprised. At dinner, he talked about promotions, raises, and people with traditional careers. He never asked how my work was going. It felt like he had already decided how my story would end. My mother tried to check on me. She asked if I was eating enough and whether business was paying the bills. I told her everything was fine. The truth was more complicated, but I didn't want her worrying. The second year brought changes I hadn't expected. A small boutique in Nashville placed a wholesale order. Not long after, another store reached out. For the first time, growth felt real. Revenue climbed past $18,000. The business was still small, but it was moving forward. I hired Pri, a college student from my neighborhood, to help a few days each week. Her support gave me time to focus on new designs and customer requests. Eventually, I moved my work out of my apartment and into a small studio downtown. Walking into that space for the first time felt like crossing an invisible line. This wasn't just a hobby anymore. I rewarded myself with a leather planner that cost more than I normally would have spent. Every page quickly filled with schedules, goals, and ideas. So I said nothing to Dad. The distance between us had settled into place. The following Christmas, he slid a certification program brochure across the table and suggested I consider a stable career. I thanked him politely. A few minutes later, I walked out of the house carrying that pamphlet. Before driving away, I dropped it into a trash can and headed home. The third year began with something I never saw coming. One morning in February, I woke up to dozens of order notifications on my phone. At first, I thought there had been some kind of mistake. Then I discovered that a popular lifestyle blogger had featured my embroidered linen pouches in a gift guide. Overnight, more people visited my shop than I had seen in months combined. Within 2 days, every item I had listed was sold out. The excitement lasted about 10 minutes before reality kicked in. I had to make and ship everything. For the next 2 weeks, I worked late into the night filling orders. Some evenings I barely noticed the clock until it was after 3 in the morning. My hands ached, my back hurt, and my kitchen table disappeared beneath piles of fabric and shipping labels. But for the first time, I wasn't struggling to find customers. I was struggling to keep up with them. As spring arrived, the business continued growing. I offered Pri a full-time position and she accepted immediately. Having someone dependable beside me changed everything. While she handled packaging and inventory, I could focus on new products and planning ahead. I also sat down with my fabric supplier and negotiated better pricing. It felt strange discussing business contracts when only a few years earlier I had been sitting in a cubicle entering information into spreadsheets. Yet each step made me feel more confident. That summer, I launched a collection of personalized kitchen linens embroidered with family names and custom designs. Customers loved them. Orders arrived steadily, and before long they became my most requested product. Month after month, revenue climbed higher. For the first time, I opened a dedicated business bank account. Soon afterward, I met with an accountant named Bex. She was practical, direct, and impossible to impress. After reviewing my records, she looked across the desk and said something nobody in my family had ever said. "You've built something real here." The meeting lasted less than an hour, but those words stayed with me. I sat alone in my car afterward, staring through the windshield. I hadn't realized how badly I needed someone to acknowledge the work behind everything I had created. By October, things were running smoothly enough that I finally felt proud of what I had built. Then Dad showed up unexpectedly. He often stopped by with leftovers from Mom, so I wasn't surprised to see him at the door. What surprised me was the timing. I was in the middle of photographing products. Fabric rolls lined one wall. Finished orders were stacked neatly nearby. Lighting equipment filled the corner. Dad walked slowly through the room, taking everything in. For a moment I thought he finally understood. He picked up a table runner, examined it, then set it back down. Instead of commenting on the business, he asked if I was managing to pay my bills. That was when I realized the problem wasn't that he hadn't seen what I was doing. He had seen it. He just didn't believe it mattered. I told him everything was fine, handed him Mom's empty containers, and watched him leave. After Dad left that day, I stopped expecting him to understand. It wasn't anger anymore. It was acceptance. I had spent years hoping he would notice the effort behind the business, but every conversation ended in the same place. He saw risk where I saw progress. He saw uncertainty where I saw opportunity. So I put my attention back where it belonged. December arrived, and with it came the busiest season I had ever experienced. Orders filled every corner of my workspace. My personalized kitchen linens had become unexpectedly popular, especially as holiday gifts. New requests arrived faster than I could complete them. Customers were willing to wait weeks for their orders, which still felt unbelievable to me. Not long ago, I had been refreshing my shop page hoping someone would buy a single item. Now I was managing a waiting list. The days blurred together. Mornings started with coffee and order reviews. Afternoons disappeared into sewing, embroidery, packaging, and customer messages. Most evenings ended long after sunset. Around the middle of the month, Bex emailed me a financial summary. I opened it while sitting alone at my kitchen table. Projected annual revenue, $46,000. I read the number twice. Then a third time. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen while my coffee cooled beside me. The figure felt unreal. 2 years earlier, reaching a few $100s in sales during a month had felt like a victory. Now the business was earning more money than I had ever made working full-time at the insurance company. I also knew something else. Years before, Mom had casually mentioned Dad's salary while explaining why family vacations weren't possible. Looking at my own numbers now, I realized I had surpassed that amount. The thought didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me quiet. Because none of this had happened overnight. Every dollar represented early mornings, missed weekends, rejected ideas, and countless moments when quitting would have been easier. I closed the email and went back to work. Christmas Eve arrived before I was ready for it. At 7:42 that morning, my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. I glanced at it while reaching for my coffee. Then I froze. The annual deposit summary had updated. My business account had officially crossed $48,000. For a long moment I sat there looking at the screen. 3 years. 3 Christmases. 3 years of hearing my work dismissed. Without overthinking it, I got dressed and drove to my local bank. A cheerful teller named Gail greeted me when I walked in. I asked if she could print a complete year-end account statement. A few minutes later she handed it across the counter. I thanked her and slipped the paper into my purse. Back in my car I unfolded the Christmas card I had already bought for Dad. It was simple, plain and green. The front carried only one word. Dad. I carefully folded the statement and placed it inside. Then I sealed the envelope. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't bringing explanations to Christmas dinner. I was bringing proof. With the envelope resting in my coat pocket, I drove toward my parents' house with a calm expression and a plan I intended to see through. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the envelope was still resting inside my coat pocket. I could feel its weight every time I moved, even though it was only a card and a folded sheet of paper. The house looked exactly the way it always did on Christmas Eve. Warm yellow light spilled through the windows. Garland hung along the staircase. The smell of pine mixed with the scent of pot roast drifting from the kitchen. Mom had spent days preparing everything. As soon as I stepped inside, she wrapped me in a hug and immediately started asking if I was hungry. For a moment, standing in that familiar entryway, it almost felt like any other holiday gathering. I hung my coat on a chair near the door, making sure the envelope stayed tucked safely inside the pocket. One by one relatives arrived. Uncle Bart showed up with his wife, May. Lena came with her boyfriend. Uncle Ross arrived laughing before he even made it through the doorway. Aunt Pat followed shortly after, carrying a dessert and enough curiosity to interrogate everyone in the room before dinner was served. The evening moved along comfortably. I helped Mom carry dishes to the table and refill drinks. I smiled when expected. I listened to stories I had heard before. Years of family gatherings had taught me how to blend into the background when necessary. Dinner finally began. Plates were filled and passed around. The conversation bounced from work to sports to neighborhood gossip. Ross launched into a story about his truck needing repairs. Bart debated football standings. Everyone seemed relaxed. Then Aunt Pat turned toward me. "Still doing your little craft business, honey?" The question wasn't unusual. She asked something similar every holiday. I opened my mouth to answer, but Dad spoke first. "She's still doing it," he said casually from the head of the table. "Not sure what she's getting out of it." A few people chuckled politely. I felt the familiar sting, but I kept my expression neutral. Then Dad did something I never expected. My purse was sitting beside my chair. Without thinking twice, he reached over and picked it up. It was the kind of thing parents do when they still see their grown children as teenagers. Before I could react, he unzipped the front pocket. Inside was the cash I had withdrawn earlier that week. 2 $20 bills and a 5. Dad glanced inside and held the wallet open slightly. $45, he announced. His voice carried across the table. 3 years of work. He wasn't shouting. That somehow made it worse. He sounded amused, like he had delivered a harmless joke. The room instantly changed. Ross let out a short laugh before realizing nobody else was joining him. Bart suddenly became interested in his dinner plate. May stared at her glass. Lena looked horrified. Nobody knew what to say. For a brief second, every sound seemed to disappear. I felt every eye in the room shift toward me. 3 years of effort, sacrifice, and sleepless nights reduced to a punchline based on the cash in my purse. But I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply sat there and looked back at my father. Because hidden inside my coat pocket only a few feet away was something that would make this moment look very different before the night was over. For a moment after Dad's comment, nobody seemed to know how to respond. Then Mom broke the tension the way she always did. "Dale," she said softly. It wasn't loud or angry. It was simply a warning. The kind she had been giving him for years whenever he crossed a line without realizing it. Dad glanced up, set my purse back beside my chair and picked up his fork again. The conversation slowly restarted. Someone asked for more rolls. Ross returned to talking about his truck. Plates shifted around the table. Within minutes, everyone was acting as though nothing unusual had happened. But I felt it. The embarrassment settled inside me with a familiar weight. It reminded me of that first Christmas when everyone laughed at my business idea. Some moments don't disappear after they happen. They stay with you. They become part of the way you see people and part of the way you see yourself. Across the table, Lena looked at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her expression carried all the words she wasn't comfortable speaking out loud. I'm sorry. I gave her a small nod and looked away. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I ate my meal. I answered questions when people spoke to me. Aunt Pat asked whether I was dating anyone. I told her no. She immediately started offering suggestions. I smiled politely and changed the subject. I passed dishes around the table and laughed when appropriate. From the outside, I probably looked completely normal. Inside, I felt distant from everyone in the room. The humiliation wasn't coming from strangers. It was coming from my own father. That was what made it hurt. Eventually dinner ended and people drifted toward the living room. Football appeared on the television. Wrapping paper rustled as relatives organized gifts for later. I stayed behind to help Mom clean up. We worked side by side in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Plates went into the dishwasher. Leftovers were packed into containers. Then Mom spoke. He doesn't mean it the way it sounds, you know. I rinsed a serving spoon under warm water. I know, Mom. He worries about you. I know. She placed a plate carefully into the dishwasher and sighed. He's proud of you. He just doesn't. She stopped searching for the right words. I dried my hands and looked down at the counter. Mom, I said quietly. I know. But the truth was more complicated than that. Maybe Dad worried. Maybe he cared. Maybe he even believed he was helping. None of those things changed what happened. Being mocked still hurts even when it comes from someone who loves you. Being dismissed year after year leaves marks whether they're intentional or not. For 3 years I had swallowed every comment and every doubt. I had waited for the work to speak for itself. And suddenly I realized I was done waiting. I finished drying the last dish and hung the towel over the oven handle. Then I walked toward the front door. My coat was exactly where I had left it. I reached into the pocket and wrapped my fingers around the envelope. The paper felt smooth beneath my hand. For the first time that evening I felt completely calm. The time for silence was over. I stood for a moment with the envelope in my hand, letting the calm settle over me. The anger from dinner had faded. The embarrassment was still there, but it no longer felt sharp. What remained was certainty. Everyone had gathered in the living room by then. Dad sat in his favorite recliner near the Christmas tree. Uncle Bart and Uncle Ross occupied the couch. Lena sat on the floor beside the coffee table, scrolling through her phone between conversations. Aunt Pat was already asking when dessert would be served. Mom moved between the kitchen and living room carrying plates and drinks. It was the familiar part of the evening when people exchanged cards and small gifts. I walked into the room carrying the stack I had brought. One by one I handed them out. A card for Mom. One for Lena. Another for Bart and May. The room remained relaxed. Christmas music played softly in the background while relatives talked over one another. I saved Dad's for last. The green envelope felt strangely light in my hand considering everything it contained. I crossed the room and stopped beside his chair. Merry Christmas, Dad. He smiled and accepted it without a second thought. Thanks, kid. There was no tension in his voice. No sign that he expected anything unusual. To him it was just another Christmas card. I stepped back and watched. Dad slid his thumb beneath the flap and opened the envelope. The card came out first. Then the folded sheet tucked inside followed. At first he paid little attention to it. He unfolded the paper automatically while glancing at the card. Then his eyes landed on the page. I saw him focus on the bank logo at the top. His expression changed slightly. His gaze moved lower. Account holder. Rue Calloway. Rue and Linen Company. Then he reached the annual deposit total. $48,214. Around him the room continued as normal. Ross was talking about football. Bart was arguing about a playoff prediction. Pat was discussing dessert options with May. Nobody noticed anything. Nobody except Lena. She looked up and immediately sensed something had changed. Dad stopped moving. The conversation around him seemed to fade into the background. His eyes returned to the number. Then back to the top of the page. Then down again. As though checking whether he had somehow misunderstood what he was reading. The confidence he had carried all evening disappeared. Confusion came first. Not disbelief exactly. More like someone trying to rearrange years of assumptions in real time. Then came another expression I couldn't fully name. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't embarrassment. It lived somewhere between the two. For years he had measured my success using his own standards. In a matter of seconds, those standards had failed him. The room still hadn't caught on. Only Lena and I understood what was happening. Finally, Dad lifted his head. His eyes met mine. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I didn't need to say a single word. Everything I had spent 3 years proving was already sitting in his hands. And for the first time since I started my business, my father was seeing it clearly. For several seconds nobody said anything. The living room had been full of conversation only moments earlier, but now a strange silence settled over everyone. It started with Uncle Ross. He noticed Dad wasn't responding to the discussion anymore and glanced in his direction. The moment he saw the paper in Dad's hands and the look on his face, he stopped talking. Uncle Bart followed his gaze. Aunt Pat turned around in her chair. Lena remained on the floor with both hands wrapped tightly around her mug, watching quietly. One by one, everyone became aware that something had shifted. Dad lowered the statement and folded it carefully. He wasn't rushing anymore. He wasn't treating it like an ordinary piece of paper. He set it on his knee and stared at it for a moment before looking at the green Christmas card still resting in his hand. Then he looked at me. The confidence he usually carried around family was gone. "This is real?" he asked. His voice sounded different. Lower. Less certain. I nodded. "Printed it this morning. At the Maplewood branch." Nobody interrupted. The room remained completely still. Christmas music drifted softly from somewhere in the background. The tree lights reflected off the ornaments. Outside, snow tapped lightly against the windows. Yet all attention stayed fixed on Dad. He looked down at the statement again. 48,000. He didn't ask it like a question. He simply said the number out loud. As though hearing it might help him understand it. As though the words themselves felt impossible. I knew exactly what was happening. For years, Dad had built a picture of my life in his head. In that picture I was struggling. I was stubbornly chasing an unrealistic dream. I was wasting time on something he believed could never become a real business. Now that picture was falling apart. Not because of an argument. Not because I had defended myself. Because of facts. A single page had accomplished what 3 years of explanations never could. Nobody seemed eager to speak. Even Aunt Pat, who normally filled every silence she encountered, stayed quiet. Finally, Dad looked up again. There was no anger in his expression. No attempt to challenge the numbers. No excuse. What surprised me most was what he didn't say. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't immediately admit he had been wrong. Instead, he spoke 4 simple words. "I didn't know." That was all. The sentence hung in the room. And strangely, it was enough. Over the years, I had imagined this moment many different ways. Sometimes I pictured myself delivering a long speech. Sometimes I imagined listing every comment that had hurt me. Sometimes I imagined making him feel exactly what I had felt. But standing there now, none of those things seemed necessary. Because, "I didn't know," carried more weight than anything else he could have said. It was an acknowledgement. An admission that his assumptions had been wrong. A recognition that there was a reality he had failed to see. At that moment, Mom appeared in the doorway holding a dish towel. Her eyes moved from Dad to me, then to the folded statement on his knee. She understood immediately. And for the first time all evening, nobody in the room seemed interested in pretending everything was normal. The silence didn't last forever. In my family, uncomfortable moments were rarely discussed directly. People preferred to move around them instead of through them. Once the shock settled, everyone slowly returned to whatever they had been doing before. Uncle Bart cleared his throat and made a comment about how good the pot roast had turned out. Uncle Ross asked whether there was any coffee left in the kitchen. Aunt Pat finally remembered dessert and immediately started discussing pie options. The conversation restarted in pieces. Nobody mentioned the statement. Nobody brought up the wallet incident. Nobody pointed out how dramatically the evening had changed. Yet everyone felt it. The atmosphere wasn't tense anymore. It was different. Like a picture hanging slightly crooked on a wall. Nothing was broken, but nothing looked exactly the same either. Dad remained quieter than usual. Every now and then I noticed him glance toward the folded paper resting beside his chair. Not with disbelief anymore. With thought. As relatives moved around the house, I slipped into the hallway for a moment to get some air and escape the attention I could feel building around me. Lena followed a few seconds later. The moment she reached me, she grabbed my wrist. "I can't believe you actually did that," she whispered. Her eyes were wide. For years she had watched every holiday conversation unfold. She had seen the comments, the jokes, and the assumptions. She understood better than most people what that envelope represented. I smiled for the first time all evening. "Merry Christmas." She laughed immediately. Not because the joke was particularly funny. Because the tension had finally broken. Because somebody had finally challenged a story the family had accepted for years. We stood there talking quietly until voices from the living room pulled us back. As the evening continued, coats started coming off hooks and leftovers were divided into containers. People gathered near the door saying goodnight and making plans for Christmas morning. I was reaching for my coat when Dad approached me. For a moment we stood alone in the narrow hallway. The noise from the kitchen faded into the background. Dad looked at me longer than usual. Not critically. Not skeptically. Just looking. Felt strange. Almost as though he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dad was never someone who gave long speeches. Eventually he asked a simple question. "You did that yourself?" I knew exactly what he meant. The business. The growth. The years of work nobody had really understood. "All of it," I said. He nodded slowly. There was no argument. No attempt to minimize it. No suggestion that luck had played the biggest role. Just a nod. Something softened in his expression. Maybe respect. Maybe admiration. Maybe the beginning of both. Then he reached out and briefly placed a hand on my shoulder. It lasted only a second. For someone else, the gesture might have seemed insignificant. For my father, it was enormous. It was the closest thing to an apology he knew how to give. Before either of us could say more, Mom called from the kitchen asking who wanted leftover rolls. The moment ended as quietly as it had begun. But as I put on my coat, I realized something important. The distance between Dad and me wasn't gone. Yet for the first time in 3 years it felt smaller. I drove home that Christmas Eve with the heater running and the radio silent. Snow drifted across the road in thin streaks while the events of the evening replayed in my mind. Dad holding up my purse. The laughter. The envelope. The expression on his face when he saw the statement. The brief touch on my shoulder before I left. For years I had imagined how this moment would happen. During difficult nights when orders piled up and exhaustion made me question every decision, I often pictured proving everyone wrong. In those daydreams the victory was dramatic. People apologized. The room erupted with reactions. Every person who doubted me suddenly changed their mind. Reality looked nothing like that. Nobody made a speech. Nobody stood up and defended me. There was no dramatic confrontation. Just my father sitting quietly in a recliner with a piece of paper in his hands. And somehow that mattered more than any fantasy I had created. Because I eventually realized the point had never been to impress the room. I didn't care what Uncle Bart thought. I wasn't looking for approval from Aunt Pat. I didn't need relatives discussing my business for the rest of the night. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted my father to see me. Not the version of me he had imagined. Not the struggling daughter he worried about. The real me. The woman who had spent 3 years building something from almost nothing. That night he finally did. The realization stayed with me long after Christmas passed. About 6 weeks later, my phone rang on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It was Dad. There was no special occasion. No holiday. No reason for him to call. After a brief conversation, he asked whether I would have time to explain how my business actually worked. He sounded genuinely interested. Curious even. I agreed. The following Saturday we met at a diner halfway between our homes. When I arrived, Dad already had a small yellow notepad sitting beside his coffee cup. For the next hour he listened. Really listened. He asked about suppliers, shipping costs, inventory, and customer orders. He took notes while I explained things. A few of his questions were surprisingly thoughtful. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about whether my business was real. It was about understanding it. When breakfast ended, I reached for the check. Dad picked it up first. Neither of us mentioned it. He simply paid the bill and stood to leave. It was a small gesture, but I understood what it meant. As I drove home afterward, the heater hummed softly and the radio stayed off, just like it had on Christmas Eve. The difference was how I felt. For years, doubt and old hurt had followed me everywhere. Now that weight was gone. The thing sitting in my chest wasn't resentment, disappointment, or the need to prove anything. It was just quiet,